We're back at chapter 18. It's called The Names. In the previous chapter, we had Miss Honey divulging the story of pretty much her life to Matilda, who probed her to understand why she was living in a cottage like that in such poverty. And Matilda felt that there was something beneath it. And Miss Honey explains to her what happened with essentially her aunt. And it turns out that her aunt is, in fact, Miss Trunchbull, which is where the chapter closes. This chapter, along with the previous one, highlights this shift from the fact that Miss Honey was asked to help Matilda in effect because of this discovery of her new power. And now there seems to be a change, a shift in power between Matilda and Miss Honey, where it's as though Miss Honey is depending on Matilda, which in fact admits that she finds Matilda to be very grown up. This chapter is also pretty short. It sees Matilda and Miss Honey moving away from the cottage, but also we will explore a little bit the themes and recap a couple of the themes that we've been going through as the book is coming to an end. The chapter opens with Matilda obviously shocked that this is Miss Trunchbull, but then also she understands how Miss Honey is the way that she is, given how she's seen Miss Trunchbull behave in her school with other children, such as she explains the occasion when she threw the girl with the pigtails for having pigtails. I'm going to read the passage that we're going to look at now. You haven't seen anything, Miss Honey said. This is in terms of the kind of abuse. After my father died, when I was 5.5, she used to make me bathe myself all alone. And if she came up and thought I hadn't washed properly, she would push my head under the water and hold it there. But don't get me started on what she used to do. That won't help us at all. No, Matilda said, it won't. We came here, Miss Honey said, to talk about you, and I've been talking about nothing but myself the whole time. I feel like a fool. I am much more interested in just how much you can do with those amazing eyes of yours. I can move things, Matilda said. I know I can. I can push things over. How would you like, Miss Honey said, if we made some very cautious experiments to see how much you can move and push? Quite surprisingly, Matilda said. If you don't mind, Miss Honey, I think I would rather not. I want to go home now and think about all the things I've heard this afternoon. Miss Honey's description of what Miss Trunchbull used to do to her, pushing her head under the water for not bathing properly, would obviously be quite frightening to any reader. But on top of that, she says, this is just the beginning of you understanding what Miss Trunchbull might have done to her. By doing this, the author is obviously leaving it up to the reader to imagine how far Miss Trunchbull could go, and what horrors Miss Honey has sustained under her so-called care. And this builds the case against Miss Trunchbull. And of course, you have a little Matilda listening to this very carefully and making her own up about what could have happened to her dear Miss Honey. Now, Miss Matilda over here is also extremely practical, as always, as she says, this would not help things, and Matilda agrees, no, it wouldn't, and she kind of always wants to move on to the next step, to the next point of action rather than mulling over and being overly sentimental. So in conclusion, I think we can say that this new bit of information has jogged something in Matilda, because the next thing that she asks to do is to leave Miss Honey's home, even though Miss Honey seems very enthusiastic about exploring her powers, and that's probably why they went to her cottage. Matilda now, with this new information, is set on leaving and going home because she needs to, as she says, think about it. Miss Honey also steps into, again, a different mode, a different attitude towards Matilda, and she's back in the driving seat. She is back as the carer, and she's like, yes, of course, let's go. And you see her taking on the adult role, and Matilda is now the child again as they leave the cottage, with Miss Honey being concerned about the fact that Matilda's mother might be worried, which of course Matilda says, no, she never worries. Doesn't matter. Now that they're walking back home, the intensity of all of this information on Matilda can be seen by the fact that they're very quiet. Miss Honey realizes that she wants this quiet as well. And Matilda's obviously mulling over all of these things. And in fact, as Miss Honey leaves Matilda at her home, Miss Honey apologizes for the terrible tea that she offered Matilda. She realizes her inadequacy, the fact that, you know, the tea was actually quite measly, not very much of substance. But Matilda's very gracious and says, no, it was lovely and so on. And but you can feel that there's a change, there's something happening, and there's something brewing over here. I'm going to read you this passage. Miss Honey is worried about what she has told Matilda and the effect that this has on Matilda. To the passage. Matilda. I won't promise to stop thinking about it though, Miss Honey, Matilda said. I've been thinking about it all the way back from your cottage, and I believe I've got just a tiny little bit of an idea. I would like to ask you 3 last things before I stop talking about it, Matilda said. Please, will you answer them, Miss Honey? Miss Honey smiled. It was extraordinary, she told herself, how this little snippet of a girl seemed suddenly to be taking charge of her problems, and with such authority too. I love the way that Miss Honey calls Matilda a snippet of a girl. A snippet is a small piece or a kind of an extract. So it's as though she's not even a whole girl. She's so small. She's just like a little piece of a girl. And obviously that compounds the fact that Miss Honey is so surprised that this girl is taking on all these big concerns that she's had in her life, and feels like she's taking control of it. Matilda's obviously, as we're walking, planning something, and because she's lost in her thoughts, and the way that she asks the questions also tells the reader there's something hatching over here. It's important all along. We've seen Matilda develop as a character, and this theme of justice and how to make things right is so extremely important to her. Now we have Miss Honey, who has been wronged, and this clearly is going to motivate Matilda further to do something about the situation, as we will see in the rest of the book. At this point, given that there are only a few chapters left, I'd like to revisit a couple of themes over here. So the first one is adults, children, and power. It's very clear that Matilda explores this contentious power dynamic between adults and children. What does this mean? Children, all children, reasonably feel and resent the fact that adults in their lives are all powerful and generally constantly tell them what to do, and they have no power over these adults in their lives. Now, in the book, on top of this, we have adults who, on top of being all powerful, are often unkind adults who ask for unreasonable thing or behave in unreasonable way towards children. Matilda, we have this in Matilda in two settings. We have this in her home, where her parents are obviously absolutely unreasonable and quite ridiculous and make ridiculous requests of her. And also in Cruncham Hall Primary, where we have Miss Trunchbull, who is the epitome of the cruel adult who not only punishes misbehavior, disobedience, and arrogance in extreme ways, such as putting them in a chokey, which is absolutely unimaginable, but also having random dislikes for children just because, such as disliking little girls in pigtails and throwing them across the playground for having those pigtails. Now, the readers, who are primarily the children, it's a children's book, are elated by the reactions of the children in the books when they retaliate and when they bring in their own way of fighting this injustice, even though they are little tricks. So as a reader, you are thrilled when you see that Matilda is sticking a parrot up the chimney and scaring her parents and putting glue on the hat of her father and bleaching her father's hair. We are elated when we see Hortensia and her little tricks with Miss Trunchbull get her into a lot of trouble, and also Lavender by putting the newt in the water. It's a bit of a hurrah moment for the children who are reading this book when they see the adults confronted with these episodes and the frustration and pain sometimes in some of the cases that these adults go through, and they feel a little bit of justice and there's release. So even though we've said this, even though there is no permanent change to the situation and the dynamic, there is, however, an element of this allowing the children to maintain sanity in face of the abuse. So this remains very important. The second theme we'll review is the power of fighting injustice, which of course is very much related to the former in changing the dynamics between adults and children. We have in Matilda an example of what the author wants us to understand. The fact that a little 5-year-old has exposed herself to reading the classics, to reading essentially to education. It has opened up her eyes and developed Matilda's moral compass very early on. So at only 5 years of age, she has a very clear understanding of right and wrong, and that fighting injustice is required, and you need to recognize that injustice exists in order to fight injustice. Now, Matilda, having developed this moral compass, is very early on compared to her brother Mike, who does not read and has therefore clearly, it seems, no idea that his father's practices are incorrect, immoral, and that is how the author is very much highlighting Matilda is on the right path, Mike is on the wrong path, because they see Mr. Wormwood's unethical sale practices very differently. Also, having learned that Miss Trunchbull is the abuser of Miss Honey and remains such through her adult life, we've seen in this chapter Matilda recognize this and understand that something needs to be done. And we see Matilda in her thinking mode, as we have seen previously when she was at home, when she had been the recipient of some kind of ill treatment by her parents, by her father mostly, and she goes straight into this planning mode, and this is where we leave her in this chapter. Now, the second point is simply recognizing abuse and injustices seems to give victims a certain amount of additional power. It is the bravery that we see again in Hortensia, the bravery that we see in Little Lavender, and of course, Matilda. So even though these pranks do not change the adult's behavior, however, there are moments of victory where there is either humiliation on the adult's part, and also Mr. Wormwood actually does change his behavior even for a short amount of time, and that is extremely important. Significantly, the author seems to imply that just recognizing injustice literally gives Matilda a superpower. And this comes, as we know, in the weekly test, the chapter called the weekly test, where on witnessing the bullying of her fellow students and herself, Matilda is so furious that she develops the ability to move objects with her mind. Now, she, in that episode, punishes Miss Trunchbull by dropping over the glass with a newt on her. And that is making very, very literal the idea that by recognizing injustice, you can give someone great power.